Joining us now is Ryan Bohl, Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst at RANE. Ryan, good to see you again. I want to start by asking you about what the Hamas negotiator Khalil al-Hayya is saying. He basically wants guarantees of a permanent ceasefire as part of any deal to return the hostages. I'm going to assume that the only leader who actually can provide that assurance is Donald Trump. The question I have is he inclined to do so? We all know the Ukraine story. And is it even realistic in the longer term to seek a permanent ceasefire?
Well, Donald Trump has shown little inclination to use America's substantial leverage over Israel to force the Israelis to do things they don't want to do. And unless Donald Trump changes his mind on this, the situation will remain where Israel is still in a position where it can undermine ceasefire talks and negotiation processes that this particular Israeli government thinks aren't in its interests. So we really need to see a change from President Trump. Personally, he seems to have a pretty free hand to deal with this from a domestic front. So it boils down to his personal calculations. But at the end of the day, I think President Trump wants to achieve a ceasefire that seems to please everybody. And that is a strategy, I think, for disappointment, since one side or the other is going to have to give up something significant to end this war.
Just to press you on Hamas's demand, Ryan, what kinds of guarantees or enforcement mechanism would Hamas consider credible or effective to ensure a lasting ceasefire, do you think?
I think the number one demand is the Israelis withdrawing from the Gaza Strip in their entirety. Now, the Israelis have said they want a buffer zone within Gaza. It could be 5 kilometers and it could be much deeper than that. But that's, I think, the top demand is that Hamas wants to see the Israelis exit the Strip and go back to the status quo ante of September 2023. And that's pretty hard to see the Israelis agree to under this government or future governments because of the events of October 7th, 2023. They simply believe that if they create a new power vacuum in the Gaza Strip, it'll be filled by Hamas or another group like Hamas, and then they'll be facing down a similar security challenge sometime in the foreseeable future.
Ryan, I want to ask you about the ongoing talks right now in Egypt. We're hearing about the late inclusions of Qatar's prime minister and also Turkey's intel chief. They'll be joining Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Ron Dermer at the talks. I'm just wondering if they say anything to you about their inclusions and you know, in particular, if they indicate that a deal is actually closed for the first phase.
Well, I think a temporary ceasefire is in a better position now than it has been since the January, at the beginning of the year. If we do see a ceasefire, we'd probably want to think of it as a temporary one that has all the obstacles that the previous ceasefire at the beginning of this year also had. You know, the permanent position of Israel in Gaza, the permanent position of Hamas in Gaza. Those are still major hurdles. But I think there's an awful lot of international pressure on Hamas and on Israel to at least get to a ceasefire that allows the humanitarian crisis to be eased and for some hostages and prisoners to be exchanged. And it is in the interest of both Hamas and Israel to buy that sort of proposal and to get some time for each side. The Israelis are very war-weary. Prime Minister Netanyahu needs a political win. His poll numbers are not very good. And Hamas, of course, is facing considerable pushback from inside of Gaza itself, including the mayor of Gaza City, who's saying that they want a Hamas-free future for the Strip. So both sides have a reason to go along with this, but it's later on in those later negotiations where they're going to try to set the other side up for failure so that when fighting likely begins, they'll try to pin the blame for it on their opposition.
So what are the deal killers or spoilers you see as most plausible?
Well, number one, the Israelis are probably not going to leave the Gaza Strip anytime soon. It's not clear that Hamas ever will either. That would also be a quick solution to the war, is if Hamas chose to go into exile, much as Yasser Arafat did from Beirut after the 1980s war. If Hamas was willing to leave the Gaza Strip in its entirety, that would probably reduce Israel's strong political imperatives to remain the military occupier of Gaza. Beyond that, there's also these issues of de-radicalization within Gaza. What does that actually look like? Does it mean the Israelis are running the schools? Does it mean the Israelis have a veto power over whatever authority is running the Gaza Strip, and other major issues like reconstruction. Who's going to be paying for that reconstruction? And what will it be allowed to do? After all, Qatar had a major role in supplying Hamas with basic humanitarian aid, but the Israelis believe that strategy failed, that Hamas used that aid to build up its arsenal to attack Israel. And so Israel might want to veto on that sort of aid into the future, but that's something that both Hamas and Palestinians in Gaza would object to, concerned that Israel would weaponize it to force Gaza into becoming more of a pacified borderland. That's Israel's ultimate goal, is to turn Gaza into a quiet and a pacific place where Israel has full security control and no longer faces any extended threats.
Right, which brings me, Ryan, to this question about disarmament. We know that Hamas has backed off on some of its traditional red lines, but it's stayed silent about, disarmament. It has said, though, that it would do so if certain political conditions were met, like a fully sovereign Palestinian state. Does Trump's 20-point peace plan talk about this, address this sufficiently? And I guess there's also the question of armed resistance as core to Hamas's identity and strategy?
Yes, and I don't think that the 20-point peace proposal deals with this anything more than aspirationally. There's an awful lot of things to untangle to restart the two-state solution, from the many Israeli settlements in the West Bank to this kind of geopolitical strange place that Gaza has ended up in, where nobody really knows what to do with it, but nobody really wants to own it either. Those are all issues that have to be dealt with before we start the two-state solution that would set up an independent Palestinian state that would then allow Hamas to say, we can disarm now. So it seems like what Hamas is doing is really kicking this can down the road as far as they can to say, we'll need our weapons in at least some capacity so that we have legitimate leverage over the Israelis to ensure their good behavior, their compliance with whatever ceasefire deal there might be. And so it looks like to me, both sides are trying to kick the can down the road as far as they can on this very, very thorny issue. And of course, the Israelis themselves have made it very clear under both Netanyahu and the previous prime minister, Naftali Bennett, they don't want a Palestinian state. They won't support one and they won't allow one. And that's an obstacle that has to be overcome as well. So I tend to see this as something that's going to be, it still remains aspirational, and I don't see it coming to fruition anytime soon.
Okay, and Ryan, as we enter the third year in this war, the war's toll has been staggering, not just in human terms, but reputationally for Israel. Just how much damage has Israel's conduct done globally with accusations of genocide and a growing diplomatic isolation? And can Israel ever really recover from that?
Well, the places where Israel's PR really matters is in the Western democracies. And I don't think that they will be coming back from this reputational hit. I think there is now a generational divide, a religious and nationalist divide. There's a values gap that is so significant that I think it will take a full generation before people in the West might view Israel outside of the lens of the Gaza war. I think that younger people in Europe, in the United States, and Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand, they will always associate Israel with this Gaza campaign and the humanitarian catastrophe. Now, that being said, I think it will still take many more election cycles in places like the US before we see this sentiment change translate into substantial strategic change. There's other ways that could happen too. There's plenty of people who argue that Israel is using up too much of America's weapons, or that America should be keeping its money at home. If there's ever a major geopolitical crisis, like say in Asia over Taiwan, I think Israel would struggle to be rearmed under those circumstances. Or if there's a recession here in the US, that'd be another driver to reduce aid to Israel. But otherwise, short of those scenarios, I think that Israel is going to be watching cycle by cycle as new governments are elected in the West that are able to be more critical of Israel, reduce support for Israel, even impose sanctions and isolate Israel more and more as this decade ends and the next one begins.
Ryan, thank you. Always great talking to you. Ryan Bohl is Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst at RANE.